Okay, in the next segment, not in this one, but in the next segment, we will be combining an animation like this one of a spaceship with a background scene that we fly through. Now, before we do that, we need to work a little bit with an image sequence like this. This one is from Steve Burns. He is the president of the Photoshop user group in San Diego. He also is the president of the Lightwave 3D user group. And he modeled this spaceship in Lightwave 3D, if I recall. There's actually quite a bit of details on how he did it and texturing it and all that on the Facebook groups. So wanted to mention that whatever the 3D tool is that you use, whether it's Carrara or Lightwave or some other tools that you use to build your spaceship, at some point you may want to render an animation of it, and you may have rendered it at very high quality, single frames with transparent background, and here you're looking at it and you say, I wish I had rendered a little bit more. Right? Maybe you want this scene here where the ship is flying into like a way into the scene that we will be compositing with it, maybe a landscape scene or something from Dog Waffle. But we need more frames, right? So what I want to show you is that in many cases you can produce additional frames with the motion interpolation. Now that's not always going to be possible, especially when things are moving too fast. Like here we have very drastic topological changes in the pictures. But let's first see how we even start with this animation. How do we load that into Dog Waffle? Of course we go into animation. And let me actually show you first what we are dealing with. Here is a look at the folder containing these images. Right? So you basically are, you may typically have an image sequence of this sort. You may have PNG files, and they do have, in this case here, they were rendered with saved with 32-bit total depth, so RGB plus alpha. That means you have the transparency mask. And if you load just a single image, you can see, for instance, if you go like this into, where do I have this on my desktop? Come on, give me the desktop. Desktop, and I think I have it under presentations. Where's my presentation folder? There it is. Alright, so in my presentation folder, I had a presentation on February 22nd, and that's where Steve Burns, where is it? Pegasus, there, Starship by Steve Burns. Alright, so we have this kind of animation or image sequence, and I'm going to load, let's say just one, this one here. Alright, let's zoom in a little bit, see which ones they are. This one here, open that and load that into just a standard image. So right now I'm going to lose the animation that I had. So it looks like we have the image here. I can store that just to have a snapshot of it. But we actually have more than the image. We also have the alpha channel, and we can enable the selection mask here, alpha on, and sure enough we also get the marching ants showing where the transition is of being non-selected and being selected. And you can see if you store the alpha, there it is. So you have an alpha mask, and if you're dealing with animations of this sort, it's great to have that alpha channel. That comes in really handy many times. Alright, so we understand what we have, but now let's look at a different aspect. It's not the alpha channel I'm interested in right now. I want to load just an image sequence and see if I can produce a slightly longer image sequence. So here's where you can load an image sequence. You go to the animation menu and load sequence. Now this produces a different interface. It also remembers where you loaded an image in the past, the most recent one, in this current session. So if you don't do that, if this is the first time you go in, you'll want to navigate to wherever your folders are that contain your image sequence. In this case, I'm going to go and look for my presentation folder, and in my presentation folder, look for Pegasus. There it is, Starship by Steve. And one thing you'll recognize is that you may have multiple images in there, and maybe you only look for one type. So make sure you filter here by the right file type, And then you can also say, okay, let's click one or two. Let's load just a few of these images, just to get an idea of what are the images I'm going to see when I load them. Maybe I know it's not at the beginning of the animation sequence, but I'm not sure exactly which ones to start with. So I'm going to select these and load those. And so once I have those loaded, I have a short animation. That's good. It's not quite everything, though. I want to be a little bit before that and a little bit beyond that. A few more frames, please. So I'm going to go back to load sequence. And it still has that selection of the frames I just loaded. So it can go a little bit earlier, maybe 4 or 5 before that, and a few more past that, and load that. And so now I have a sequence that, okay, I can work with that. I want to see if I can make this one last much longer. Right? Do a smooth interpolation. Now, before I do that, I want to store a copy of this because I'm going to be working with this quite a bit. Another thing I also want to do is perhaps crop to it and, just work on a smaller section here. The rest of the background is black. I'm not going to need that. So I'm going to say, let's use the crop tool. Actually, before that, let's store just that image as is, that animation. So let's go to the animation menu and store the animation to disk. That way we have a snapshot. The time it takes to store that will depend on how fast your hard drive is and how many frames and how big it is. The animation, this takes quite a bit of disk space, but it's better to have it on the hard drive than have it in memory, in RAM. So don't waste your memory for that unless it's a short one, a small animation. So I'm going to now crop to just around the area where this animation is really happening and of interest. So I'm going to go to the image menu and look for the crop tool, and there I can go and select something like this. All right, I can scrub through that to make sure my spaceship doesn't walk out of the frame of interest of the cropping area. That's good. Okay, it's actually getting smaller as it goes to the right. It's not coming out of the scene. So that's one way to do that. Another way is to cancel this instead of cropping it. Cancel this and actually use a rectangle selection tool, rectangle to alpha, and do a selection like this. And if you're a little bit off, you can use the control key to move, to drag this with the left button. And again, you have a selection that indicates what part is going to be selected, and then you can crop to that selection. Instead of using the crop tool, you can crop to selection, right? And so now you have the entire animation like this. And be aware that you may have selected odd numbers for your dimensions. The thing is that you did this manually. So if you look at image info, it's quite possible, and sure enough, in this case, both the width and the height were a little bit off from a even number. And that's something you may want to change before you save this animation at some point. If you save it to AVI, the codecs are usually not happy about odd numbers. I'm going to store this to disk though, so as long as we work in our own internal DWA, dog waffle animation format, it's fine. And what I'll do next is to see what can we do now to track this, right? To do an interpolation that's smoother. Because there's a couple of ways to do this, and one is if you right click on the animation, you see the frames related tools. You can see also right click on the animation toolbar, that is, not on the animation itself. Or if you go to the animation menu and look for the frames editing tools, there it is. You can see there is a time stretch. And that can be used to create a smooth animation as well. But it often has a side effect that is not too desirable. Let me show you. If I go and multiply it by 2 and by 2 again, so I have 68 frames or even more. Let's say 272 frames, even more than that. Do a very slow animation, right? That's going to transition from one frame to the other. You could do that without frame blending, but that's not going to produce much interesting animation. It's going to basically hold the frame about 10 times, or 10 frames or 16 frames, and then switch to the next frame and then to the next one and so on. Let's just have a look at that. That was quick. So when you play it, it looks like it's not doing an interpolation. It's just holding it for a bunch of frames and then it's switching to the next. So you can see that also here as you're scrubbing through that. All these frames are identical because we did not ask for for interpolation. But here is a transition where we change from one frame to the other, and I bet you we can find some more like that. So there is always a place where there is a transition, but then there's a long series of frames with the same content. And that's what we get when we do animation without interpolation, without blending, right? Interpolation without blending. So let me go back to that. That's why we store these, so we can click, just simply click here, and that will restore the animation to the one that was saved away here, stored away. So now what I want to do is use the other method, which is the time stretch again, but the other mode rather, with the frame blending. Right? So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. How many did we have? About 500. So this time with frame blending, and you think that that should produce a better animation. Sure enough, it seems like something is changing as we're going here. But if you look closely, all it's doing is it's blending one frame out while the other frame is blending in. Right? So that is the nature of frame blending. There's really nothing you can do about it. You have one frame, you're going to another frame, somewhere around here. Hold on, let me see if I can get closer to it. So there is a frame here, there's another one here, and we're trying to see this one disappear gradually rather than instantly or suddenly. And the frame blending is going to take care of that. But of course, you can tell that it's doing this. And if it's going very slowly, it's not too disruptive and too disturbing, but it's still noticeable. You can still see it. Let's go do that again, but perhaps with fewer frames. Let's do that. Time stretch, and this time just up to 128. There, with frame blending. 136. All right, so now let me zoom in, and you can use the magnifying glass here, or use the Control Shift both at the same time, and the right button, left button to move it around, right button to zoom in. All right, so I'm zooming in here so I can see better what's happening, and you can see now here it is frame blending, but it looks like there's some sort of a transition. You can tell at some point you see ghost images. You see two images at the same time. All right, for instance, look at this here. Okay, so we got this image here, right? And we know the next image is going to be around here. This bar is going to be around here, right? And sure enough, as we go to the next frame, you can see it appear. There it is. Here it was, and here it comes, and then it disappears again. And so the next one appears and disappears, appears and disappears. And so if you play this fast enough, it creates a strobing effect, especially when you have high contrast elements, pixels that are high contrast next to each other. This creates a flickering or a strobing effect. And it would be so much better if we could actually follow where it's moving. It's not changing shape a whole lot. It is a little bit because of the perspective changes the view. But it's mostly a transitional movement, a side slider. And so it would be nice if we could actually track where these things go and just interpolate from one position to the next tracked position. That's exactly what we do. That's exactly what we can do with the motion estimated interpolation. So the time stretch is not the way to go. Let's go restore the image here. This is the animation with just about 16 frames. And now let's try with the motion interpolation. So I'm going to go with animated, click the filter menu, go to animated, and select motion prediction module. Right. So in the motion prediction module, what you get to do is, let's zoom in a little bit so we get a closer view. With the motion prediction module, what we do is we lay out a grid, and you can see it here as you change it, of variable density, and that grid represents a motion tracker. Each square has a motion tracker attached to it. So on each of these little squares, imagine a motion tracker that's going to check what is the content of this square that it owns, and where did it move in the next frame. Now we need to tell it how far it can look, and that's what this does. This one here sets the distance. You see these blue arrows here, how far to look for possibly where it may have moved. And so let's use something that's kind of close to the default, about 12 for the size, and I don't know, about 60 or something like that. Let's make it 100. Make sure you make it a dry run, because we're going to do some tests here. Read those tooltips, they're very important. Uncheck the scan for dropped frames. We don't have any dropped frames here, and go. So we're going to produce out of the 16 or so frames, 17 total. 0 of 17 right now is where we're at. We're going to have a new total number of 46. And now let's increase the number of tweens. Let's go to 9. So it's a little bit better. Let's go to 22. So we're going to have 300. Now it still has a little bit of noise, a different type of noise, and sometimes you really can't do much about it. It depends a bit on how fast things are moving. It depends a bit on whether we're able to track it. Depends also on whether we have a grid spacing that's just not seeing the difference. So we're going to have to experiment with this until we are perhaps able to find a way to make this work. I'm thinking maybe a higher number. 12 works very often really well. Let's go like this. Another thing we might want to do is here, the fudge factor. Let's keep it very low. Yeah, that looks better for this bar. Let's take a look now, zoom in to really see it in more detail and see if we can identify any parts that are still in need of improvement. Wow, look at that. That's pretty slick. Better than I expected. Okay, so we now have the ability to produce this frame interpolated animation. And when you think about it, maybe rendering this spaceship could have taken, I don't know, an hour per frame, or 10 minutes per frame, 1 minute per frame. It depends on the level of quality, right, and how much detail there is in that 3D object. And so, if you have an animation sequence of just 30 frames, that may have taken half an hour to maybe a few hours to render. Now, in just a few minutes, we can produce 20 times that many frames that are very good quality in between. So one thing you can also do is add a refinement pass to make it even better quality. If you have noisy images, you might want to have a stochastic average of 5 frames, 2 before, 2 ahead, and 2 after. You can also have some other levels of quality of the refinement service here. I'm just going to undo the dry run here and go. So we now have 331 frames, whereas before we had only 17. And that, of course, will make for a much, much longer animation, much slower movement. And let's see it at full speed, at full size. The last frame, by the way, the last frame is not usable. The first frame is actually a copy of the last frame. So when you use the motion prediction module, make sure you delete that first one. And there you go. So now we have this animation that looks so much better than if you had done the frame blended time stretch, right? The frame blending in the time stretch. Look at that. Let me zoom in so we can really appreciate beautiful motion estimated animation and interpolation of this 3D scene. All right, thanks for watching. We'll be using this technique for compositing images or animations into another scene and combining things. But even if you just have something like this by itself, I hope this is going to be useful for working on your animations.